Something about this story refuses to stay private. Whispered conversations in hallways, a housekeeper's quiet account, tense family meetings held behind closed doors, and police interviews that sat hidden for months before being released, and when they were finally heard, they changed everything. If you want to follow every twist and new document as it appears, hit subscribe and turn on your bell now. This is an unfolding investigation that keeps producing surprises and more questions than answers. What I'm about to lay out is a careful, human account of the major developments, the evidence people cite, the reasons different players acted as they did, and the consequences that have rippled outward from one family and one network into the broader public conversation about accountability, trust, and protecting the vulnerable. Daystar is not a typical broadcaster. It has been run, for decades, as a family enterprise whose brand and leadership were largely synonymous with the Lamb name. That institutional intimacy helps explain why network leaders spent months rallying around a staffer now widely identified as Josh Brown even as troubling allegations circulated. When a problem appears inside a closely held family business, the first instinct for many is containment, to keep the issue from public view, to defend people you know personally, and to try to resolve the matter internally through family meetings, prayer, or private mediation. Those instincts are human and understandable, especially in a faith-based environment where spiritual reconciliation is often the default framework for conflict resolution. But the downside of this approach is plain. Protecting the reputation of the institution and sheltering a family member can be perceived, and often functions as, shielding wrongdoing. As months passed and more voices came forward describing the same patterns of behavior, critics argued that the network's protective posture allowed a potential problem to fester rather than be addressed with independent rigor. The longer this dynamic held, the greater the erosion of trust among viewers, donors, and ministry partners. What began as an internal family dispute about how to handle allegations evolved into an institutional crisis because the normal private fixes of a family structure clashed with the public's expectation that allegations involving children be handled transparently and independently. Joni Lamb's fierce public defense of Josh Brown has been a flashpoint for critics and supporters alike, and that reaction is rooted in the tangled roles she occupies: a grieving widow, a grandmother, a ministry founder, and the network's leader. When those roles overlap, decisions are rarely impartial. Faced with accusations against someone linked to her family and her ministry, Joni's reflex to deny and protect reflected the same instincts that guided the network: keep confidence, preserve ministry continuity, and trust those close to you. Understandably, many viewers expected a different posture: immediate public transparency and an unequivocal focus on the child's welfare. Instead, prayer meetings, private interviews, and insistence that matters be handled within the family framed the early days of the dispute. Supporters say Joni's defense came from love and conviction. Critics say it prioritized reputation over safety. That perception is the heart of the scandal. A leader's attempt to guard a ministry turned into the appearance of something darker when independent voices and documentation later suggested those private defenses may have obscured important facts. The sheer speed with which the public's confidence frayed shows how quickly faith communities, and their financial and relational networks, can unravel when leadership appears to close ranks rather than open the doors to outside review. The personal cost for Jonathan and Susie Lamb has been enormous. What began, they say, as simple parental concern and a series of private complaints escalated into public exile. They report being urged to keep the matter inside family channels, to trust that leadership would handle it, and, at points, to accept private reconciliation rather than law enforcement, guidance they believed was wrong. Their decision to press the issue, first internally, then with authorities, and finally in public interviews, placed them at direct odds with the family's leadership and the network's priorities. In many family-run organizations, dissent is often read as betrayal because it threatens both familial harmony and donor confidence. When Jonathan continued to press for independent investigation and transparency, it appears the family and the network moved against him professionally. He was demoted and, ultimately, terminated from his role. Susie, likewise, lost her on-air position. To many observers, their firing looked like retaliation, a punishment for not staying quiet, and reinforced a narrative of power protecting itself. To others, those leadership moves were painful but necessary attempts to calm a tumultuous situation and preserve the organization. The tragedy at the center of this is that the very people who say they sought safety for their child lost the security and community that once supported them. Their story illustrates how family loyalty and corporate governance can collide, and how speaking up internally in a family-run ministry often costs far more than it would in a typical corporate setting. A turning point for public perception came when Rebecca and JW, close family members and insiders, shifted from initial support for Josh Brown to telling investigators they had witnessed behavior they found inappropriate. That reversal did not happen in isolation. It followed conversations with a long-serving housekeeper who had lived in and around the family's day-to-day life for years. People in that position see patterns others do not. What a child refuses, who the child avoids, repeated small interactions that look harmless in isolation but disturbing in accumulation. The housekeeper's accounts reportedly aligned with previously private concerns that Jonathan and Susie had raised, and those corroborating observations apparently led Rebecca and JW to re-evaluate their initial posture. To many, their pivot was decisive evidence that the problem extended beyond a single family complaint. To others, the switch raised questions about the pressures insiders face. Were they guided by newly discovered facts, or by the impact of power shifts, personal loyalties, or external persuasion? Whatever motivated their change, its effect was decisive. When family defenders move toward corroboration, the case stops looking like a bitter family feud and starts appearing as a pattern of conduct that multiple independent witnesses observed. One of the most shocking elements released in the police interviews was the specific, credibly described claim that witnesses perceived forced mouth-to-mouth contact. That allegation is not a casual one. It is precisely the kind that triggers formal police inquiry and deep public alarm. The accounts heard in interviews describe moments that witnesses felt crossed a hard boundary. Yet there is a legal and evidentiary gap between witnesses saying they believed they saw something terrible and prosecutors being able to meet the high bar required for criminal charges. Child abuse cases often lack immediate physical evidence, and young children frequently cannot provide the coherent, forensically admissible testimony that criminal prosecutors require. The result is that investigators can unearth distressing testimonies but still conclude that what can be proven in court is insufficient for charges. This difference between what people believe happened and what investigators can charge legally drives much of the outrage. Observers hear the witness statements and expect prosecutions. Investigators, bound by the evidentiary rules, sometimes must decline. That dissonance, serious witness testimony on one hand and a closed prosecutorial file on the other, fuels the argument that family and institutional influence may have blocked fuller accountability, while others maintain that the rule of law requires standards that protect both children and the accused. Brown's recorded interviews show a pattern that troubled many listeners: categorical denials followed by tactical reframing when confronted with specific allegations. That pattern, initial outright denial, legal counsel stepping in to soften or contextualize, and then adjustments in description, is a familiar defensive posture in high-stakes interviews. To neutral observers, however, those shifts can signal evasion. In investigative contexts, exact, consistent memories help build credibility, changing narratives erode it. Brown's responses moved from blunt denial of certain acts to labeling them as affectionate gestures, cheek kisses, forehead pecks, done in public and in front of adults. For many who had heard multiple witnesses describe repeated episodes, those reframings felt like damage control rather than clear explanation. Whether those changes were a lawyer's attempt to minimize or a sincere effort to clarify is something only a neutral fact finder can judge. In the meantime, the sequence of denials and restatements became a core reason so many viewers and commentators doubted the official narrative that closed the case. The emergence of the housekeeper's testimony, often referred to publicly by her first name, was especially impactful because non-family staff bring a different sort of credibility. Housekeepers, nannies, and longtime employees live inside the rhythms of family life. They observe the small, repeated behaviors that accumulate into patterns. When such a staff member speaks up, it is often interpreted as harder to dismiss than a family member's claim, because the staffer arguably has less to gain from taking sides and more to lose if they speak out. In this situation, the housekeeper described witnessing interactions at the pool and elsewhere that made her uncomfortable and aligned with what parents and other witnesses reported. Her presence in the reporting shifted the story in a material way. The allegations were no longer only a parental claim versus a defended uncle. they began to look like a pattern people outside the inner family circle had also noticed. That kind of corroboration is powerful and also human. It shows how private, repeated behaviors, small touches, odd kisses, unusual access, can feel obvious to those who see them repeatedly, even if each event looked, in isolation, ambiguous. The incident at the Miramar Beach house in August 2021 became the shorthand for the entire dispute because it was simple and concrete. A child was found unclothed in a room in which an adult relative was present, and that sighting triggered immediate, visceral responses from the child's parents. Whether the adult's presence was intentional, innocent, or predatory is the core contest of competing narratives. For those who believe the parents, the scene is a clear example of boundary crossing that could not be dismissed. For defenders of the accused, the same scene is offered as a messy snapshot misinterpreted in the heat of a parenting moment. But even for those comfortable with ambiguity, the episode illustrates how a single event can crystallize a set of fears. Once that picture was shared privately and then leaked publicly, it forced choices: who to believe, how to investigate, and whether to place family loyalty ahead of independent review. The beach house moment was the accelerant, and the subsequent chain of meetings, demands, and legal steps all trace back to that morning. After months of interviews, legal review, and public pressure, law enforcement ultimately closed the file, citing insufficient evidence and noting no child outcry had been made in the way required by prosecutorial standards. That decision, a legal closure, does not erase the witness statements nor does it resolve the moral questions pressing the community. In many jurisdictions, child abuse prosecutions require either clear forensic evidence or a child's direct disclosure corroborated by independent physical or testimonial evidence. Without such elements, prosecutors often decline to charge even when witnesses describe behavior that, to them, appears inappropriate or even criminal. This legal reality is frustrating to families and supporters demanding accountability. It is similarly raw for those whose reputations were shattered by allegations. The closure leaves the case in a painful limbo, legally resolved for now but socially and morally unresolved. The role of investigative journalism in this story has been decisive. When previously private police interviews and witness statements were released to the public, many viewers heard things that changed their judgment. Raw audio and transcripts allow listeners to hear pauses, emphases, and lawyer interventions, elements a second-hand summary misses. The release of these materials reignited calls for independent review, for transparency, and for reforms in how family-owned ministries handle allegations. That public airing changed the story from an internal family conflict to a national conversation about governance, donor oversight, and how organizations that serve vulnerable people must create clear, external reporting channels. Once the materials were out, the pressure on Daystar and affiliated ministries intensified. Partners paused programming, donors asked hard questions, and viewers demanded answers they felt could not be delivered through limited, family-only inquiries. What remains is a complex, painful tangle of human stories: a child whose voice has been muffled by time and trauma, parents who insist they sacrificed everything to protect that child, family members who initially defended a relative and later said they saw conduct they could not ignore, staff who stepped forward with corroborating observations, and a legal system that closed its file while many in the public still demand fuller accountability. The bitter but necessary lesson here is simple: institutions that serve vulnerable people cannot reconcile serious allegations through private family processes alone. Independent, third-party investigations, transparent reporting procedures, and safeguarding mechanisms that operate outside family loyalty are essential if trust is to be rebuilt. As this story continues to unfold, the public will keep asking the same hard questions. What truly happened that morning at the beach house? Why did the network protect a staffer so long? Why did family members' accounts shift? And how can a community learn from this to prevent future harm? Those questions deserve answers, and the best path to them is openness, independent review, and a commitment to prioritize the vulnerable over reputation. Until those steps are taken, the shadows around this case will only lengthen, and the real work of healing, accountability, and reform will remain unfinished.